We crisscross the globe looking at the similarities between fairies and aliens. Now let's get into the good stuff, the interactions between humans and fairies/aliens. The subscribe and like button have been communing with the aliens. If you like and subscribe, maybe they will share their wisdom with us. This video is going to cover close encounters of the 4th through the 6th kinds. Now J. Allen Hynek's encounter scale only goes up to 3, but UFOologist Jacques Weisweiler proposed a 4th encounter and UFOologist Stephen M. Greer a 5th kind. The 6th encounter category was invented by me for this video series. In an encounter of the 4th kind, an abduction occurs. Alien abductions and fairy abductions are shockingly similar. I'm going to go through step by step all the similarities. The basic structure of both kinds of abductions is as follows. A person or group of people are alone, often out on a road or in nature, although not necessarily. Sometimes alien abductions take place in homes or other buildings. Examples of this include Betty and Barney Hill, Antonio Villas-Boas, Zygmunt Adamski, Travis Walton, Robert Matthews, Cherry of Zinor, Reese and Llewellyn, as well as Stray Sod and Will-o'-the-Wisp tales. Time may pass differently, be unusual or dreamlike in some way, and abductees often have unaccounted for time after the event, as in all the cases I previously mentioned. Betty and Barney Hill's abduction story is probably the most famous abduction story of all time. But essentially, the couple was driving, encountered a UFO, was taken by aliens, experimented on, and then returned with missing time, at least according to them. This is one of the most researched and talked about cases, and I think it has many of the hallmarks of a fairy abduction story as well. For instance, the Hills trip took 7 hours instead of the 4 it should have. Antonio Villas-Boas is another famous abductee. He was a Brazilian farmer who in 1957 claimed to be abducted by aliens and had 4 hours of missing time. The aliens' alleged experimentation on him was also sexual in nature, and I will explore that in more detail in my next video. Zygmunt Adamski, a British man who died under mysterious circumstances, was missing for 5 days, but he only had 1 day's growth of beard. Adamski also had burns and a strange ointment on his body that could not be identified. Remember that ointment. We're going to come back to it later. Travis Walton is an American who went missing for 5 days in 1975 and said aliens had taken him during that time. He claimed to have no idea that he'd been gone that long. American Air Force member Robert Matthews saw strange lights in the sky, called someone at the Air Force Base to pick him up, and claims to have called again a few minutes later only to be told that it had been over an hour. Matthews had experienced no break in time, but he was seemingly missing for an hour. Moving on to fairy stories, Cherry of Zinor was supposedly hired to be a nursemaid/servant for a fairy household, and she also experienced missing time. I'm going to examine Cherry's case in detail in this and my next video. Anne Jeffries, a 17th century woman who supposedly spoke with fairies, experienced missing time, but for her, more time had passed in the fairy world than in the human world, the reverse of what usually happens in abduction stories. I'll be examining Anne's story at greater depth further on in this video, as it is quite fascinating. In the Welsh story of Reese and Llewellyn, Llewellyn is seduced into a fairy dancing ring, and when he is pulled out, he has no idea how much time has elapsed. This type of story is exceedingly common, so common that I could not begin to list them all here. For instance, Stray Sod and Will-o'-the-Wisp are fairies from European folktales who confuse travelers and cause them to become lost on familiar paths, experiencing missing time. This type of fairy isn't limited to Europe either. It is a global phenomenon. Examples include the Turkish Azmich and the Japanese Onabi. So now that we've established the missing time connection, let's discuss what actually happens during the abductions themselves. In some cases, medical experimentation seems to be performed. In other cases, the abductions seem linked to reproduction. More on that later. I'm dedicating an entire video to that. I'm going to cover major abduction features present in the stories I've already mentioned, but know that I am only scratching the surface of the depth of stories on this topic. In the Hills abduction, tissue samples as well as possible sperm samples were taken, and a needle was inserted into Betty's navel. Villas-Boas told of being stripped, bathed, having painful blood samples taken, being sexually assaulted by an alien, and then being returned to Earth with unexplained sores on his body. Of course, a great many mythological creatures steal blood and sexually assault people, such as vampires, succubus, and sukuyan. In these types of attacks, abductions, whatever you want to call them, there is not necessarily communication between the abductor and the abductee. When the abductor specifically communicates with the abductee, that is a close encounter of the 5th kind. Cherry of Zinor and Anne Jeffries both experienced this kind of interaction. Cherry was used as a nursemaid to a fairy hybrid child, which is also a type of alien abduction experience. She wasn't chosen to receive a message, but the fairies did talk to her, instructing her to care for a child. I described the child as a hybrid because the little boy had to have an ointment applied to his eyes, and when Cherry applied it, she could see the fairy realm as it really was. If the boy was fully fairy, he likely wouldn't need an ointment. When the fairies discovered that Cherry was using the ointment, she was returned to Earth. A little side note, I think it's interesting that an ointment, which could be seen as scientific in nature rather than natural, appears in both Cherry's story and Zygmunt Adamski's. He had an unidentified ointment on his corpse. Again, this implies a corporeal and scientific nature to the fairy/alien phenomenon, rather than a magical and spiritual one. This is something that leaves behind physical evidence. Moving on, Anne Jeffries had a positive experience, similar to the types of abduction stories where the aliens supposedly give messages to humanity. She returned from the fairy realm now supposedly able to heal people. There is a whole group of people who often describe themselves as experiencers, who claim to have neutral or positive interactions with aliens, who give them messages about enlightenment or warnings about humanity destroying the earth. Hynek described it thusly: the visitation to the earth of generally benign beings whose ostensible purpose is to communicate, generally to a relatively few selected and favored persons, messages of cosmic importance. These chosen recipients generally have repeated contact experiences involving additional messages. In other cases, the communication is more about the curiosity of the human. Irish poet W.B. Yeats supposedly had communications with fairies where he asked the fairies questions. Yeats supposedly spoke to a fairy queen who told him that her people were much like human beings and do most of the things human beings do, but she also warned him not to seek to know too much about fairies. Now I'm going to talk about what I call close encounters of the sixth kind, contact with a fairy or alien that results in a death. I'm going to hone in specifically on cattle mutilation, although there are instances where human death was blamed on fairies or aliens, such as the aforementioned Zygmunt Adamski. Cattle factor prominently in both fairy stories and in alien stories. Also, if you recall, in the first video of the series, I spoke about the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki moon god Sin, or Nana, traveled in a moon barge and had cattle associations. So we have connections to cattle in space that date back millennia. Moving into the Middle Ages, fairies and cows continue to have connections. The Scottish Gruagach, for example, was a protector of livestock. Additionally, fairies were said to torment horses and other farm animals by knotting their hair into fairy locks. They also sometimes stole cattle and replaced them with fake fairy cattle. In one Welsh story, a man awakened during the night, beheld his cowshed, which opened off his bedroom, filled with a multitude of little beings about 1 foot high, swarming all over his fat ox, and they were preparing to slaughter the ox. He was so surprised that he could not move. In a short time, the very Volk had killed, dressed, and eaten the animal. The feast being over, they collected the hide and the bones, except one very small leg bone which they could not find, placed them in position, then stretched the hide over them, and as the farmer looked, the ox appeared as sound and fat as ever. But when he let it out to pasture in the morning, he observed that it had a slight lameness in the leg, lacking the missing bone. This is strikingly similar to modern alien stories. The man is unable to move, the creatures kill his cow and replace it with a fake one. Moving into the modern era, we get cattle mutilation stories, often attributed to aliens, but still seemingly part of an unbroken interest in livestock by some unknown force. I can't possibly cover all of the modern-day cattle mutilation cases. The amount is truly vast, but I have included a link in the video's description to the FBI's declassified documents on cattle mutilation for those who want to take a look. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to discuss the alleged Skinwalker Ranch in Utah because I feel it contains major elements of UFO/alien and fairy stories. The ranch was purchased by Terry and Gwen Sherman in 1994. They lived there for 2 years, during which time they supposedly experienced multiple supernatural events. The Shermans were cattle ranchers and kept a herd on the property. The first unusual thing was that strange wolves, bigger and stronger than normal wolves, appeared and disappeared in the thin air. This is significant for a number of reasons. Firstly, because the wolves' descriptions being similar to dogmen or Bigfoot, who are also linked to UFOs. Also because wolves have a long mythological history. Lastly, because these sightings would give the ranch the nickname Skinwalker Ranch. Skinwalkers are shapeshifters from traditional Navajo belief, and some claim that they haunt the ranch. After the wolves came the UFO sightings, crop circles, and cattle mutilations. The mutilations were surgical and bloodless, which recalled the Welsh story where the cow was killed and then reconstructed with only a single bone missing. The Shermans also claimed to have seen a 7-foot-tall, heavy-set humanoid exiting a spacecraft once. The description calls to mind, again, Bigfoot. There are also reports of glowing orbs seen on the property, which call to mind ghost lights like the Will-o'-the-Wisps. After 2 years of suffering, the Shermans sold the ranch. However, the mysterious events continued into the early 2000s before seemingly stopping. Cattle mutilations, though, continue globally to this day. In fact, there is a current case going on right now in Texas. 6 cows were found in the same condition, except 2 also had circular cuts made with the same precision to remove additional external organs, according to the sheriff's office. In all 6 cases, the sheriff said there were no blood spills or signs of struggle. The grass around the deceased animals was also undisturbed, and there were no noticeable footprints or tire tracks in the area, authorities said. Neither predators nor birds scavenged the remains, leaving the bodies to decay untouched for weeks, according to the sheriff's office. This is really a standard cattle mutilation case, and it shows that the issue is ongoing. There is a reward out, and if this is really just the doing of a disturbed person or group of people, I hope that they are caught by the proper authorities. I hope you've all enjoyed this deep dive into the connections between fairies and aliens. In the next video, we will explore the sex, reproduction, and hybridization aspect of fairy and alien reproductions. Until then, stay weird.